It's been an extraordinary summer. Heat waves, drought, and wildfires have dominated the headlines. But this extreme weather raises an interesting question. Did ancient Britain have heat waves and wildfires? Let's start in the Stone Age. We can't simply look up the weather forecast for 4000 BC, but surprisingly, there are ways of finding out. Pollen preserved in peat, ancient insects, lake sediments, and one particularly useful bit of evidence: charcoal. Because if tiny fragments of charcoal become buried in peat or lake sediment, they can survive for thousands of years. And that can tell us when the landscape was burning. But charcoal alone doesn't necessarily tell us why it was burning. Was it caused by people, or was it a natural wildfire? That's where the other evidence comes in, and there's a fascinating example surprisingly close to here. Research in the New Forest has combined ancient charcoal with evidence for vegetation and climate to reconstruct thousands of years of fire history. And researchers found that periods of increased burning coincided with warmer, dry conditions, suggesting that climate played an important role in those ancient fires. Fast forward a few thousand years, and Britain looks very different. Farming has spread across the landscape. There are fields, livestock, and established settlements. And when it comes to fire, there's a complication. Not every ancient fire was necessarily a wildfire. There's evidence that prehistoric people may have used fire to help alter and manage parts of the landscape. Something that may actually have been happening long before the Bronze Age. But how do we know? Well, one clue comes from tiny fragments of charcoal preserved in peat and sediments. When archaeologists find an increase in charcoal alongside changes in pollen, perhaps woodland declining and more open vegetation appearing, it can suggest that burning was helping to change the landscape. And at some sites, we can actually date those episodes of burning. On Bodmin Moor, for example, evidence shows repeated fires around the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age, which researchers think could have been either wildfires or fires deliberately started to improve grazing. But fire wasn't the only challenge. There were warmer and drier periods, but there were also major shifts towards wetter conditions. In fact, towards the later Bronze Age, evidence from peat bogs, ancient trees, and lake sediments suggests part of Britain became significantly wetter, and that could transform people's lives. Land that had once been usable could become waterlogged. Peat bogs expanded, growing conditions changed, and communities had to adapt. So there wasn't one single Bronze or Iron Age climate. But what that meant from one year to the next is much harder to see until we get to the Roman period. Because here, for the first time in our story, we can pinpoint 3 individual summers when the rain seems to have failed. And that's thanks to tree rings, more specifically dendrochronology, the scientific method of dating tree rings to the exact calendar year they were formed. Trees effectively record the conditions they grew in, and researchers have used oak tree rings to reconstruct rainfall in Roman Britain. What they found around the year 364 AD was remarkable. 364 AD was extremely dry, then 365 AD was extremely dry, and then 366 AD was dry as well. 3 bad summers, one after another. Think about what that means if you're a farmer. 1 bad harvest is difficult. 2 can become extremely serious. 3 in succession can become a catastrophe. And then something fascinating happens. The following year, Roman Britain descends into one of the greatest crises in its history. The barbarian conspiracy. Picts attack from the north, Scottish groups attack from Ireland, Saxons attack, Roman troops rebel, the province descends into chaos. Now, did drought cause the barbarian conspiracy? No, history is rarely that simple. But researchers have argued that repeated harvest failures and food shortages may have helped disestablish Roman Britain just before the crisis, which means something as ordinary as the weather may have helped change British history. As the Roman Empire declines, we enter Anglo-Saxon Britain. But here is where our story takes an unexpected turn, because one of the most famous climate disasters of the early Saxon period wasn't caused by heat, it was caused by cold. Around 536 AD, Enormous volcanic eruptions put material into the atmosphere. Sunlight was reduced. Temperatures fell across much of the northern hemisphere, and this period forms the beginning of what's sometimes called the late antique Little Ice Age. So our ancestors weren't simply dealing with heat waves, they were dealing with climate extremes. Too hot, too dry, too wet, too cold. And whichever direction the weather went, farmers were often the first ones to feel it. And in many ways, that's still true today. Britain has always experienced extremes of weather, but today's climate is changing for a very different reason. Human activity is warming the planet, making extreme heat more frequent and intense. And just like the farmers who lived here thousands of years ago, we are having to adapt. The difference is we understand what's happening, and we have the ability to do something about it.